Good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Kirsten Logan, the training coordinator at COVA. I just have a couple of announcements for you, and then we're going to get right to our presentation today. If you are not familiar with the GoToWebinar platform, first of all, this is a listen-only presentation. So if you have questions for Susan, you're going to go ahead and type them, and I'll moderate those for you. Your toolbar is a gray bar in the top right of your screen with an orange bar and a right-facing white arrow. From there, you should see questions/chat, which, as I said, come to me. Susan's also graciously provided us with a copy of her presentation, and that's in your handouts. So there's a caret that will show your handouts. It is a pretty big presentation. I did turn it into PDF, but if you have trouble downloading it, there's a link I can send you where you can get the original PowerPoint from. If you'll receive an email just a little later on today, that is your proof of attendance for this webinar. If you are applying for COVA's Victim Advocate certification and you're using this training, please go ahead and submit that email with your packet. If you're watching later on YouTube, we do hope that you enjoy the presentation and find it useful. However, archived webinars cannot be used towards COVA's certification. So with that, we are thrilled to have Susan Ramsey with us, and we're going to get right to it. Thanks, Susan.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming today, and I hope this is informative. As you were already told, feel free to ask questions as we go along. That would be fine. So I'm going to talk a little bit about myself and then a little bit about the presentation. So I am an attorney and a former nurse and a member of the National Crime Victims Bar Association, among other things. I have on this first slide a picture of an article that I wrote for Trial magazine that was published in December of 2020, which is, we're going to talk about what the article's about a little more as we get later on in the presentation. Today, I'm just going to give you an overview of substance abuse treatment centers, recovery residents, and the litigation and cases that are going on throughout the country, but mainly in the areas where there's a lot of destination sobriety. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let me go to the next slide. And hopefully this plays.
In this episode of American Greed.
It started off with sound. There we go. Okay.
But something isn't right and seems to have made it far too big.
Making 5 to 6 figures 1 year to making 10 million plus the next year, that's an indicator. These are things that we look for when we're doing investigations.
And Chapman's.
Okay, our sound is really in and out. Susan, it's
every
10 seconds it's coming on. So maybe we kind of want to skip this video and kind of summarize it.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. So let me just talk about what that video is. And it's got all the stuff associated with stories on American greed. What you just saw and what that was about. So the gentleman that was speaking is Bill Stewart. He's with the FBI. And in South Florida, there were, and there still are, 2 different investigative bodies looking into this issue. What is the issue? What are they talking about? So Kenny Chapman is now doing 27 years in federal prison. He actually pled guilty to a number of different charges, including, of course, insurance fraud, patient brokering. Human trafficking, among other things. There's another video that we may be able to hear later on that sort of describes it more financially. But how did this all, what are we talking about? So we're talking about a couple of things that happened that evolved over the last 15 years. So I'll start with this. So, and we're going to talk about substance use disorder, but the issues regarding the fraud and the like was an unfortunate consequence of two things that were very positive: the Affordable Care Act and the Mental Health Parity Act. Prior to 2008, private insurance companies were allowed to arbitrarily set limits on paying for services that had to do with mental health services, substance abuse services, and the like. And the Mental Health Parity Act now prohibits that. So insurance companies have to pay for the treatment of this particular mental illness along with others in the same manner that they would pay for the treatment of other chronic diseases. This was a very positive thing, but what it created was an opportunity for people like Kenny Chapman and others to take advantage of the population, because now all of this stuff was getting paid for. But let's talk about substance abuse and mental illness in the United States to begin with. And this is a 2019 slide, but it gives you an overview of how many people in the United States have been diagnosed with either specifically substance use disorder or another mental illness. And it's a pretty big chunk of the population. And within this population, of course, mental health diagnoses is substance abuse. I would submit to you that most people who are diagnosed with substance use disorder usually have another or primary disorder, such as depression, or even some others like bipolar disorder or other types of mental illnesses. So it's a pretty significant issue within the United States. Cost of untreated mental and substance use disorder, and it depends on who you talk to, but it's some estimate between 300 billion and 600 billion a year. That is in terms of loss of productivity, unemployment costs, disability health care costs, and criminal justice costs. The addition of COVID to the mix has really only increased the burden within these structures because of the additional stress. I have seen personally, at least in Florida and in other parts of the nation, sadly, the increase in overdoses and overdose deaths has gone up with the advent of COVID. In recent months, it seems to have been leveling off, but the addition of fentanyl on the streets has really changed it for the worse. So what are we talking about? You know, disease definition, what's in a word? So simply put, a disease is an interruption or cessation or disorder of some body function, system, or organ, right? There has to be a recognizable agent that is precipitating it and an identifiable group of signs and systems. Signs and symptoms. I use this chart because it really does ring true. The comparison between substance use disorder, addiction, and other disorders of the body. So when you look at specifically in this slide, diabetics, right? They have a disorder of the pancreas that creates a problem with managing glucose and other consequences that come from that. And the slide does identify that, right? It's a disorder of glucose uptake, sugar uptake. It is identified with certain physical manifestations, which include hyperglycemia, Oliguria and thirst are the same thing. I don't know why I said it twice. Fatigue and weight loss. And obviously there are blood tests that also will support those symptoms. What are some of the long-term consequences of chronic diabetes? And that is vascular disease, neuropathy, can't say it's kidney disease. That you can see with people who have diabetes, and with or without appropriate treatment, you could see these kinds of complications. Addiction or substance use disorder, right, is a brain disease. It's a disease that affects and the different parts of the brain. We don't need to go through all the anatomy, but it really specifically affects the dopamine release pathways in the brain. And the people who have it will relate to you that they have intense, sometimes all-consuming cravings. And we talk a little bit about that as we go. And the result of long-term substance abuse is there is actually brain remodeling, and that it affects these parts of the brain sometimes permanently. So just to give you an overview of addiction versus, other chronic diseases. So again, drug addiction is, and these are people who relapse, and we will go into that. But there's a very high percentage, 40 to 60% of people who have substance disorder or addicts that relapse or have a recurrence of their substance use disorder. This is also true for diabetics, people with hypertension, and people with asthma. So even with or without participating in medication and the like, some people can have these recurrences. And that sort of gives you the comparison of the chronic nature of those diseases as well as substance use disorder. So what's addiction? I have the picture of the brain. It is a very complex illness, and we're going to go into sort of how it's diagnosed and what it means. So again, I'm on the soapbox of what if we treated diabetes like addiction. So would we say that it's because you had a poor lifestyle that you're diabetic? I'm going to tell you that diabetics, like drug addicts, are born and made. Would we insist that you go to diabetic education classes before we treated you? Probably not. And would you get discharged if you didn't lose weight or persistently had high blood sugar from some form of treatment? The answer is generally no. So let's talk about how substance use disorder is diagnosed. So the DSM-5 is the manual that there are two sources for information and criteria for assessing somebody as to whether they have substance use disorder. So we'll start with the DSM-5. And this is, again, there are a number of symptoms. So we're just gonna skip to the symptoms, because you have to have at least two of the following over a 12-month period. So what's the first thing? Loss of control over drug and alcohol use. Meaning specifically, if you have a drink or a drug, you no longer can just say no, as you've heard, if you're old enough to know who said that, that it becomes a compulsive physiological response to the ingestion. And it doesn't happen necessarily every time a person, a drug addict or alcoholic, ingests the substance. Each person can individually tolerate at different levels. So it's complicated because it's not one size fits all. The second thing is investing large amounts of time in obtaining the substances. So if you are an individual who's plotting and planning when to get your next drink or drug, and taking all sorts of time to kind of look for the substance, or you're hiding the substance, this is one of the diagnostic criteria. We talked about cravings. That's a real physiological response to using or the absence of using. Continued use in spite of relationship conflict. So the family, the spouses, whoever is saying, hey, you're drinking too much, you shouldn't be using drugs too much, it's interfering with everyday life, but you are unable to stop. Risk taking, especially driving drunk, is really one of the criteria, is that you don't even, you're no longer concerned because your brain has been essentially taken over by the substance. I like to refer to it as your brain has been hijacked. You continue to use even though you may have liver disease or hepatitis or other types of illnesses that, you know, alcohol and drugs are, you know, being told that you can't keep using it because it'll affect the other organs of your body. Increasing tolerance level. So this is the phenomena of the more you use, the less it works. So you keep using, and the level of tolerance to the medication increases and increases and increases. So it takes more and more to do less and less in terms of either pain relief or that feeling that you are seeking in using the drugs. Loss of interest in activities that you once enjoyed. That's sort of self-explanatory. You know, withdrawal episodes. So episodes where you stop drinking or drugging and you are really hungover, strung out, however you want to put it, and it happens multiple times. Failed attempts to stop using. So you keep saying, I'm never going to do that again, and then there you are doing it again. Failing to meet obligations. Now, the next group that we're going to talk about is the American Society of Addiction Medicine, ASAM. So ASAM defines addiction this way: as a primary chronic disease of the brain, reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. I like that, related circuitry. That is essentially what I just said. It's a brain disease, and it affects different parts of the brain, and over time, it becomes much more chronic. And again, dysfunction leads to the characteristic biological, psychological, social, and spiritual manifestations. And again, it's reflected by individuals pathologically pursuing the drugs, alcohol, for relief, or as a continued desire to get back to where you were physically and mentally. So I'm just going to show you the 5 C's here and sort of the different pictures associated with the prior slides. So the 5 C's of addiction is craving, compulsion, loss of control, continued use, and chronic maladaptive behavior. So this slide sort of says it all. First, the man takes a drink, then the drink takes a drink, then the drink takes a man. So let's talk about this from what it looks like and who has this. So I share this with you because I do think it's important. I am myself in long-term recovery. I am a drug addict and an alcoholic. I know I don't necessarily look like that with the gray hair and the glasses, and I'm a grandmother and the lawyer a long time and a former nurse, but I am what you would describe as that. I probably started as more of an alcoholic, and I did start more as an alcoholic, and I am one of those people who drank socially and was quite functional for many, many years as an active, alcoholic. Did I call myself an alcoholic at that time? Not really. But when I look back, there were pretty significant consequences from the things that my drinking and what have you, including, you know, and the statutes don't run after this, but I got arrested for DUI many years ago. And that was my first sort of wake up call. And I did, you know, my family rallied around me, and I was married with 3 kids at the time. And naturally, my nice codependent parents, we blamed my then husband for this, which was kind of ridiculous, but be that as it may. And I continued on, and I did all the classic things that are really described in the literature about substance use disorder, addicts, and alcoholics, right? I could drink, you know, not every time I drank was there trouble, but every time there was some kind of trouble, there had been drinking and/or drugging. This escalated to the point where I, you know, moved from one state to another and was trying to find my way through this. And I had multiple attempts at sobriety. I did not go to substance abuse treatment, but my experience is that the insidious nature of this is it's a disease that tells you you don't have a disease. And so when you start to feel better, you say, it's not so bad. And you move on. What changed it significantly for me was an injury and opiates. And notwithstanding the fact that I was a nurse as well as a lawyer, and I did definitely have a diagnosis of low back pain, a couple of herniated discs. I got prescribed opiates for pain relief. At the time, when the opiate wars got started, when Purdue and the other manufacturers were promoting through their own organizations and marketing and what have you, that the Oxycontins and those specific drugs, if you had legitimate pain, that you would not become addicted, which was ridiculous, actually. And even though I was a nurse and should have known better, I was so happy to be, you know, pain-free. Well, within a short period of time, this escalated because I have substance use disorder. So it got much worse, to the point where, you know, I was at a point in my life where for the first time in my life, I was no longer so functional. And I, you know, actually lost my job and was the single mother of 3 and scared out of my mind. My experience is I went to a 12-step program and I've been sober ever since. However, I mean, that's not for the first time. However, I completely understand the chronic nature of this and the recurrences. And why is that one of my soapboxes? Is because this is, again, a mental illness that tells you you don't have a mental illness, that people in society at large really don't have an understanding of this disease and how it affects people and how they go on. So, you know, this isn't a matter of willpower. It's a matter of getting into the right resources and appreciating, you know, that substance abuse is very much real and very much we need to help those who are suffering. I have a soapbox now. So, this is still on the soapbox. So I'm showing these couple of slides to kind of show you the difference in brain activity, and as Dr. Volko has said, addiction is a brain disease that can be treated. So there is hope. This one is the more pronounced slide. So you're looking at 3 different scans, right? One is of a healthy person. This is their brain. And we don't need to get into all the anatomical structures. But the second one is of a meth abuser after 1 month of abstinence, right? And you see the improvement or normalcy of their brain after 14 months of abstinence. So there is hope and there is recovery. So let's talk about recovery and treatment. So we go back to the Asam criteria. Why are we talking about this now? So in the world of substance abuse treatment, there is no other area of medicine that's so murky and has very little in terms of long-term outcome studies. The American Society of Addiction Medicine is really, this group is really making, great efforts at sort of defining the criteria for admission, defining different levels of care, which we're going to talk about, defining how folks who are in or outpatient and the like should be treated and assessed and determined where they may best fit for a level of care. It's not one size fits all. And I'm very happy about this because it does give you some very specific tools, especially in the work that I do. So again, the Acm criteria and in general is, when I first started looking at these cases, now I've been a lawyer for 35 years. I hate to say that out loud, but it is true. My first 25 years, I mostly handled two kinds of cases. I represented sexual assault survivors in civil litigation, and I handled medical malpractice cases, which I still do. So I have a certain expectation of what records, medical records, health records should look like for an individual. And if I told you I've probably read hundreds of thousands of, that's probably not an exaggeration. I don't really know the number. But when I first started looking at these cases and I started getting the electronic health records, the medical records, I could line up 10 different charts and they would all say the same thing in terms of what the assessments were. They were not individualized. People were stuck in whatever they had as their program is what you got, not necessarily what was best for you. So here are the 6 dimensions of the Asam criteria, which is another way of saying how these 6 things, I'll just show you, are the criteria for determining what level of care you are. So I'm gonna put them all up at the same time. So the first thing is pretty straightforward. Is the person are they acutely intoxicated at the time you're interacting with them, or are they in significant withdrawal? And there's a scale to assess that, and obviously when's the last time you use something and what is it that you use makes a big part of the determination of where you belong. Then other biomedical conditions and complications. So for example, somebody who is a chronic IV drug user may have something like endocarditis, infection of the inner lining of the heart, or other medical conditions that need to be addressed before you can do anything else. So those folks may need to be hospitalized immediately before they go into or be part of a substance abuse treatment program. Then the emotional, behavioral, and cognitive issues that may have to do with an individual's ability to participate in a particular type of care. So, for example, people who have profound mental illnesses like schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, things like that, they may not belong in the same place that somebody with a more garden variety depression in terms of what would be the appropriate treatment for that individual. Readiness to change. And this is a little complicated in my view, because certainly as a society, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, people are sometimes court ordered to either AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, or a substance abuse treatment center, and they may not be so enthusiastic about that. But that is something to consider and to look at when you're looking at whether an individual is best suited for whatever level of care you have. Relapse and continued use. So clearly, one of the things you want to have happen is the individual is not using at the time they're in or going into a substance abuse treatment facility. But you have to also look at the relapse potential, if you will, because not all programs are suited for all people again. So if someone is an opiate abuser and has a very difficult time being detoxed, withdrawing, they may not be suited for an outpatient facility. That's an example. And here's one of the most important things, and we will talk about this, is recovery and living environment. Now, this is a double-edged sword and has been used that way. Clearly, the person who is struggling to get to a place of feeling better and relief from their substance use disorder, where they are living and who they are living with and what the community they're involved with is very significant. So, for example, a woman who's been in an abusive household and is attempting to, become sober, start recovery, I mean, that's a real issue as to whether they have a safe place to recover and to live. So that's part of the criteria of determining where somebody might fit in the scale and the spectrum of types of substance abuse treatment, which is the next slide. So I just gave you all those numbers. So they make a difference. So there's the dimensions and the levels of care. So when an individual clinician is assessing all of this, they look at those dimensions that we just went through and which ones together or in combination will tell you whether it's appropriate for a person to be at a certain level of care. So there are lots of people on the continuum of substance use disorder. So using me as an example, I did not go to treatment. That doesn't make me better or worse than the next drug addict or alcoholic, but I'm on one continuum. I'm on one end of the continuum. On the other end of the continuum are individuals who need long-term residential care and medically managed detox or other types of services. The decision should not be made based on the insurance availability, which is important. I don't mean to dismiss this completely, but it has to be made on what the actual assessment is. I mean, whether you're going to have heart surgery or not is not, whether you need heart surgery or not is not dependent on whether you can pay for it or not. You either need it or you don't. How you get it paid for, of course, is a more complicated issue. But in terms of actual assessment, that's what we're talking about. So what does that mean? That means that these criteria, these placement criteria need to be looked at, and that should be what determines what level of care an individual gets. Additionally, it should not be based on what the facility has to offer. And we will get to that, right? So, for example, if the only program the facility has is something called intensive outpatient program, but that's not appropriate for that individual, they should not take that patient. They should refer that patient to a higher level of care. But unfortunately, if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Okay, we're going to try this video. If it fails, we will skip it.
This is not a case where a few bad apples spoil the whole bunch. This is a case where most of the apples are spoiled.
Palm Beach County State Attorney Dave Ehrenberg is talking about the drug review. Some 400 addiction treatment centers are luring thousands of young people.
Parents send their kids down here to South Florida to get well, not to die.
With more rehabs here, it will be considered the recovery capital of America. And while some good facilities, sadly, scenes like this are playing out every day here. This is 24-year-old Alison Flory died in the very place she was supposed to be getting help for her addiction. She'd come here for drug treatment at a facility. From the people at Reflections? No. One ever called me to let me know. To this day, no. People run a facility where a young woman died. They never call her parents? No condolences, there's nothing. Alison had gotten caught up in the Florida shuffle, a criminal scheme born of the opioid crisis. It's making some people very rich and putting others at risk. Like millions of young people in America, Alison became addicted to opioids. Her parents say it started with pain pills in high school. She tried rehab near her hometown outside Chicago. Desperate. So Florida, why Florida?
Facilities down there that we heard about were.
It was beautiful.
It is beautiful, and it seemed like a good fit for her.
And you felt at this time hopeful?
Hopeful more than I'd ever felt ever.
The rehab center provided a free plane ticket, and Alison was off to South Florida. A crisis.
So let's talk about that case and that situation. So I had the privilege of representing that family, and I'm going to tell you a little more about this situation. So this is related to the first slide. You didn't quite see the whole thing out, but Mr. Chapman was, before he owned a substance abuse treatment center, he actually technically never owned it because he was a convicted felon, and under Florida law, and I imagine in most states, convicted felons can open up substance abuse treatment facilities. And I think Colorado's laws are very similar to Florida's laws with respect to the licensing of substance abuse treatment facilities. So it's actuality, his wife owned it. So part of what was happening for this young woman and for many other young people in South Florida, and I'll show you some more slides about that later, was they got recruited to come down here from marketers, and they were told that this is the place to go, that you should be away from your family. It's beautiful here. This family, this kid was from Illinois. You know, South Florida is a lot more fun in the winter than Illinois, I imagine. And so people would come down here, and the majority of the population of people in treatment, in substance abuse treatment during this time, were under 25. Why? Because the majority of them were covered under mom or dad's health insurance, and that's that's how they were covered. So they were doing lots of things. And I think it was in the other slide. The treatment centers would pay for the plane tickets, which is not permissible under Florida law, and it's patient brokering, among other things. But this was occurring on a big scale. Alison had been to a number of other substance abuse treatment centers prior to going to Reflections. This is really important because all Reflections had was essentially an intensive outpatient program. And in the last months before she died, she had a number of positive drug screens, right, suggesting that she was not sober, she needed more, but they didn't elevate her level of care because they didn't have it, and they didn't want to send her anywhere else. She was also living in that, I was about to curse. my apologies, in that halfway house that you saw in the other slide. So let me tell you about that place. That place had 8 people in it, boys, girls, everyone. There was drug use every single day. It was a couple's house, which is under the accreditation standards is basically a no-no. In other words, these were kids who met in rehab and were now living in houses and being bused to the treatment center on a daily basis. There was no oversight, there was no supervision, there was no house manager of any kind. Allison sadly died. 2 of the other roommates suffered pretty significant overdoses. Out of the group that was in that house at the time, it's just so tragic. So another young person died shortly thereafter. There was really no, follow-up in terms of even the other kids. The amount of time that that mom and dad, but mom mostly, tried to reach out and get information about Allison at Reflections is, it's well documented, and they told her, the mom, everything she wanted to hear, because they didn't want Allison to go anywhere else. So it's just an unbelievable tragedy. So, and we'll get more into what the Florida Shuffle looks like in the next slide. But first, we're going to talk about this. So the question becomes, and this is a current problem. There has been some, and let me back up a little bit. There has been a great deal of progress in terms of, at least in Florida and then in other states. So the video that you last saw, the person who first was speaking is State Attorney Dave Arenberg for Palm Beach County, and that's where I live. And I have the privilege of being on the civilian part of that task force. The task force was Dave's brainstorm, and he was able to get funding from the legislature. And because in Palm Beach County, there were so many overdose deaths that it's tragic, especially in Delray Beach, which you saw in the video. That was like where the population of young people dying in the streets was absolutely horrifying. In fact, Delray then passed an ordinance, because what some of the treatment centers were doing and the halfway houses were doing was, if somebody relapsed and they didn't have insurance and whatever, they would just kick them out on the street. And they were finding literally dead bodies all over Delray Beach, which is a, on the ocean kind of fancy community. So eventually that's what happened. But let's go to what this is about, the hunt for addicts. This sadly is still happening. So what happens to families, and what happened to that family, the Flory family, is they have a loved one who they want to get help for. They don't really know how to go about doing this. So what do? They go to the Google machine, which is what I would have done, and they look for, addict treatment, substance abuse treatment, whatever. Then they're directed to these websites that look like they're legit and will direct you to a specific number of different places. You get on the phone and the marketers will hunt you down and harass you, especially if you're a parent, because they will go for, if you don't put your little Johnny or Susie on a plane tonight, they're going to die and it's going to be your fault. I am not kidding as to the level of, it's less painful to buy a used car. It is just awful. And so part of this was that there were all these shady ads on Google, which finally, this is actually a couple of years old, this article. There has been a big shift towards removing this and checking this. But my recommendation for anyone who's looking for a substance abuse treatment center is there's a lot of other steps one has to go. The other thing is you don't need to come to Florida to get treatment. You know, there's a lot of other states in the union, and Colorado, of course, is one of them, but other places where, you know, you can get help close to your home. And if you are one of those individuals that needs to get, you know, someplace away from your usual place, you can still do it in the same state. So my general recommendation is you don't need to leave your home state. You just need to know what resources are available. But the motivation for this is money, of course. So we call this the Florida Shuffle. I'm just going to walk through the whole thing so it kind of makes more sense. This is how it starts, right? You have a patient. I really like this slide. So you have a substance use disorder patient, okay? In the more traditional world, they will likely need to be medically detoxed, and that's frequently an inpatient type of facility. You could do outpatient detox too, but the traditional way is you go into a facility, it could be a couple of days, it could be a week, to get medically detoxed from whatever substances you are abusing. Almost invariably, there will be a recommendation for you to go to a treatment center. And those mystery letters, PHP, IOP, and OP, are what sort of the different levels of care are. What's not on there is residential, but that's another kind. So the residential is what you would traditionally think of as the 28-day program where you're inpatient in a facility. The Florida model, which created the Florida Shuffle, really, because it was less expensive for the insurance companies, is they would pay for detox, but they didn't want to pay for inpatient residential. But they were willing to pay for something called, which is really a misnomer, partial hospitalization, which is not really a hospitalization at all. It's about 20 hours a week of face-to-face contact with somebody, a patient. Intensive outpatient is generally 9 to 12 hours. Some have a little bit longer, and outpatient is usually a couple of hours a week. From there, people were recommended, especially if they didn't live here, to go to a sober home. And then after a period of time, if everything's going well, they're sober, they're doing well, and they can move on with their lives. Now we're going to add marketers and labs. The marketers we just looked at in the prior slide are the people who are not educated necessarily in substance use disorder. They are salespeople, and they frequently will tell you that they're members of a 12-step program, just like me, but that doesn't make me or them an expert in substance use disorder and what the appropriate level of care or treatment is for an individual. The second thing, and the phenomena that really created the other not so flattering term as, you know, the Gold Coast, is urine drug screens. So the facilities made the most money on testing urine for drugs. Now, is there an appropriate number of drug screens that should be, you know, administered? Yeah, there are some standards for this, but that's not what they were doing. I have taken a lot of depositions in these cases, and the people who are administering the tests, which are just lab techs, they need a medical director to write the order. You know, they are doing it to folks every single day, and at the cost of multiple thousands of dollars a test. You can buy yourself at a drugstore a home kit that gives you the testing that you would need to do the level that you really need to do in terms of compliance. The other part is they were never looking at the drug screens. meaning the medical people and the clinicals, they were not related to anything that was going on clinically or medically with the patient. They were just being ordered to be ordered. In the case that I just mentioned, that we've been talking about, Alison's case, she had, this is no exaggeration, she had $500,000 in urine drug screens in a matter of 4 or 5 months. Now that is inexplicable, but that's what happened. Which is why it took a long time for the FBI and those to get Kenny, but once they got him, he was done. Thank God. Okay, so now how does it work? So the marketers, right, they're getting kickbacks or they are getting paid per head. So one of the things that Florida did was specifically prohibit that kind of payment. Like a marketer can't be paid per patient that they get into the place, because this is one of the problems here. And then we just have lots of money going around here. And so let's go back to sobriety. So in the Chapman case, he was specifically giving people drugs because he didn't want them to get out of his system. So there's testimony, lots of it, from individuals who were clients of patients of Reflections that told you that Mr. Chapman would actually show up at the houses and give his favored people different kinds of opiates, and they would be trading. I mean, you can't even imagine the depth and width of this. But clearly the sober person wasn't giving them the payments that they were getting when somebody kept going through the shuffle. So that is the shuffle. I don't know that it happens in your state, but I imagine that it could and it does, but hopefully not to the same degree that we had it here in Florida. So let's talk about Colorado, because I looked this up. It appears that Colorado's Behavioral Health Administration is who licenses mental health facilities and substance abuse facilities. So the model in Colorado is very similar to what we have in Florida, right? They license outpatient, intensive outpatient, I think other types of treatment, day treatment, they call that partial hospitalization, medically monitored intensive residential treatment, and inpatient detoxification. Now, it's very interesting to me as a former healthcare provider that substance abuse and mental health is licensed in most states by some agency other than the agencies that license hospitals and other types of treatment, long-term treatment, like physical rehab or nursing homes, that kind of thing. That it's called behavioral health, which I'm going to tell you it kind of bugs me. Like it's not like behavior. It assumes that you are, doing something bad. When you are somebody who has substance use disorder, you're not trying to get good, you're trying to get well. But Colorado and Florida are the same in this regard, because we license our substance abuse facilities by the Department of Children and Families and not the Agency for Healthcare Administration. So that's important because fortunately, there will be very specific licensing requirements, which is a source of information if you are someone who litigates with these places, but in terms of what they're supposed to be offering and what they're not supposed to be doing in terms of the different levels. So it's helpful, and I liked, as I said, the Colorado model is very similar to the Florida model. Well, let's talk about recovery residents, sober homes, halfway houses. So in the partial hospitalization program model, right, and the intensive outpatient program, if you don't live in the state that you're getting treatment, you're going to need to live somewhere, right? Now, Colorado is a pretty active, has its own, the Colorado Association for Recovery Residences, and they are a NAR affiliate, National Alliance of Recovery Residences. Florida has the Florida Association of Recovery Residents, of which I am their, default pro bono lawyer, but they are, this is an evolving area that people are really getting to more oversight and more regulation. And Colorado, again, has very similar to Florida. So there are generally 4 levels of recovery residents in Colorado, and they go from 1 to 4. 4 being the level that has the most supervision and oversight. And in fact, in Colorado, most of the level 4s have to be licensed by the agency that licenses substance abuse treatment facilities in Colorado, right? The Behavioral Health Organization. You can find the Colorado Association of Recovery Residents website, which I looked at. It's really great and very informative. So that can give you an idea of what are the requirements, and also it gives you a resource of where you can find these within your state. And these are the facilities, these are the homes that have been certified. I am sure, because it's true here and in other states, there are probably uncertified places, but certainly my suggestion for anyone, if some family member called me, I'd say try to get into one that is certified. And again, that I think I just said all this. This is how it's organized in Colorado, and I think this is a pretty good thing. So let's talk about the types of cases and how we can help our clients. The cases that I handle now are primarily still survivor cases, and we're going to talk about a little more about that. And the other case that we just went through are the wrongful death cases. But let's talk about the sexual misconduct cases that occur in substance abuse treatment. So when we go back to the article that is in Trial Magazine, which is, I'm talking about the article I wrote, but it does go into a specific situation, which I'm going to, as an example, I'm going to talk about. So in the substance abuse treatment facilities, right, most of them are co-ed. Most of them, that day-to-day operations, if you will, are run by people that aren't necessarily credentialed or licensed. So, and in my opinion, this is somewhat of an abuse of the 12 steps, but we will get to that. And so the scenario is what? So someone comes into substance abuse treatment, an individual who may get there because they, or voluntarily coming, or they're court ordered and what have you. I don't think I need to say to all of you that they are particularly vulnerable. And also they're maybe going through the physiological withdrawal, and that is also occurring at the same time. So survivors of sexual assault are significantly more likely to develop substance use disorder than those who have not had a history of sexual abuse or sexual assault. You will, and this has been my experience certainly, is that this article says that 75% of women in substance abuse treatment programs have reported being sexually abused. That does not shock me in one way, moment of a time. And I think that is very much true. So what happens? So let's back up a little bit, which is this is a very a place to look for what a facility supposedly offers. So this is one of them. I just made up the name of that, but this is how, from their website. So their marketing becomes sometimes very important, especially if you're doing litigation, as to what they're promising to do and what they're actually doing. So most facilities have this kind of information and is worth looking at, but what does it really mean? So this was done by this facility, but it was intended to follow the Asam criteria and, you know, the basic rights of any patient who's seeking care. But I will tell you that some of this stuff doesn't happen, like receive timely treatment by qualified professionals. That's an issue. In the world of substance abuse treatment, the general consensus, of course, is that, you know, what you offer a patient or an individual should suit their needs and should be the least restrictive, meaning people like on my end, they don't need to go inpatient. Maybe they'll benefit from an outpatient or individual therapy and their choice as to whether to go to 12-step meetings or some other support groups to people who need a lot more. But that goes back to that. So these are just places to look for information about a particular facility that may or may not be true. The statistics from the other slide are from this article in part. So the issue having to do with mostly women who suffer recurrence of their substance use disorder when they've been re-traumatized, and it's a pretty significant amount of people. So Colorado has their own, the Colorado Association of Psychotherapists, and I didn't go into all of the different professionals that are licensed in Colorado, because you also have social workers and other types of therapists that are licensed, but I suspect it would be the same. So from their regulations or code of conduct is you're not supposed to engage with sexual activities with your clients. Now, this may seem pretty obvious, but it's not. So I would also disagree with, you have to wait after 2 years, it's okay, because having sexual activity with a client at any time is generally not good for the client. We could debate that, but certainly while they're in patient or you're in the therapeutic setting, this is should be an obvious no-no, but it needs to be written and restated time and time again. And this is when it happens. So let's talk about the 12 steps a little bit so we can kind of put this all together. So the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, you know, have these sort of statements about what you're supposed to do if you're in Alcoholics Anonymous in a 12-step program. And it's very important to understand the context of this. So a 12 steps is that individuals decide whether they're going to an AA meeting or an NA meeting or not, and they participate in these steps, and it's a voluntary exchange. What's also important is it should not be, in the terms of treatment centers, it is not treatment, and treatment centers are not 12-step programs. Most treatment centers use 12 steps as sort of the basis and sort of connect people with it while they're inpatient. But here's where the difficulties arise. So, as I said earlier, a lot of times in treatment facilities, the people who are sort of interacting with the patients on a day-to-day basis, only criteria is that they've been through that program and are supposedly sober in a 12-step program. Just because I'm sober doesn't mean I'm not a horse thief. So, and it doesn't make me able to actually treat somebody with substance abuse treatment. So it's sort of like, you know, if I had my gallbladder out, I can certainly share my experience about that, but that doesn't make me a surgeon. So it doesn't make me able to take out somebody else's gallbladder. So this is where a lot of the problems lie in terms of the sexual and dual relationships in treatment centers. So the case that I highlight in that article I mentioned involved a woman who was, you know, in her 30s. She was a mother of 2. She was going through a pretty nasty divorce. She was drinking a lot. She actually did get arrested for a DUI. Nobody was hurt. It was sort of like, you know, she was actually in a parking lot, but and her kids weren't in the car, but it was quite not the best time to get a DUI given the context of her difficult divorce. She agrees with her lawyer who recommends that she go into substance abuse treatment to get her help and also to deal with the legal issues that were surrounding her, not only the criminal case, but her divorce case. So she goes, she's scared, silly, and but she really wants to get help. She, you know, she goes to the detox program, detox facility, she's detoxed, and then she is transferred to a residential treatment facility. And she wants to do everything everyone's telling her. So one of the techs, right, and he was somebody who had been through the program, that was why he was working there, really started to be super, super friendly to her initially, right? Things like, you know, giving her her phone, because most facilities want you blacked out from your phone for a week or 2 when you first get there. So he would let her use his phone. And then there were like extra, like he'd bring her some candy and things like that. I mean, he was absolutely grooming her. And then one night he showed up in her room, and these are not like rooms in a hospital. This was a PHP program, so it was a day, night with housing. The housing was actually a former motel that was 2 stories and kind of was in a square, and there was like a pool in the middle. So he was the night tech. So one wonders why you have the night tech checking on the women's rooms in the middle of the night, but that's what happened. So he came into her room and started, you know, talking to her, and one thing after another happened, and he is telling her it's okay for her to have a drink or 2 because, you know, who's going to know, and he'll make sure she doesn't get tested, and she's uncomfortable, and they have a drink of beer together. He then, without too much more, tells her that she needs to do what he wants her to do, or he will tell that she just drank, and that would cause her all sorts of complications. So within a short period of time, he's in her room almost every night. Finally, she tells him, like, you need to take me, I need more booze, right? That's because now she's really hankering and she doesn't want to tell anybody. So he's not really a genius, this guy. He takes her to a 7-Eleven and with the company credit card buys beer for both of them. Well, the next day she is caught in her room by another tech with the beer. She quickly gives up what had been going on. The owners were quite distraught about the beer and the sexual assault by one of their employees. And they brought her in, and instead of doing what they should have been doing, which is make sure she got medical care, maybe refer her to a different facility where she might be safe, acknowledge that this is not okay, they conducted their own version of the Spanish Inquisition and had her write a retraction of her prior statement, like in writing. She runs away from the place. They make no effort to find her. She manages to get back the next day. She ended up sleeping in a parking lot that night. And she came back where another counselor finally intervened and transferred her to another facility. Initially, the position of the defense was that this was a consensual event. That's where I pointed out the prior regulations and as such. But this is what happens and how it happens in substance abuse treatment centers, as well as other mental health facilities. Part of what his, let's call it a shtick, was that she needed to do step 4 and step 5 with him. So what is step 4? Step 4, if you do it with an appropriate person, is when you sit down and you sort of go through everything in your past that has, you know, where you've affected other people, where other people have affected you, and you talk about it with a trusted person, usually somebody called a sponsor. This is where he was really able to get, let me just say this, into her head by using the 12-step jargon and sort of using it against her. I think I just spoke about this, the term of victim blaming. So in the majority of these cases where I represent individuals, and most of them are women, but there are of course men, the ideology, which is sort of the just say no in another version, is that these individuals are adults and they consented to this sexual adventure misconduct. And this is just not the reality of the situation. So just like Colorado's therapist organization speaks about, you know, not having dual relationships or sexual misconduct, it's because it is well understood among psychiatry and other fields that that type of relationship with a patient is terrible for them. It's damaging. It creates all sorts of problems in the future. For example, with the woman I just mentioned, I mean, there were some additional legal consequences because of that. All of it was ultimately resolved, fortunately, but she has and still has a very difficult time in trusting anybody who is acting as her therapist. She did not want to go back to any kind of treatment, and I'm not sure she really needed that, but just she wasn't going to do it even if she did. That her ability to benefit from an appropriate therapeutic relationship has been impacted. Beyond that, even if you had a pre-existing post-traumatic stress disorder, that it's been terribly exacerbated by abuse by someone who's supposed to be in a position of trust. And these are unfortunately many of the unreported cases in the country, and you're all advocates. I'm sure you're quite aware, you know, how much sexual assault, sexual abuse is underreported to begin with, and adding the dimension of this part is, I suspect this is much more underreported than even some other situations with sexual misconduct. I do think there's help for that. I think that one of the things that advocates are really, really important is that idea that it's, it's not, this is not your doing, this is the responsibility of somebody else, and that it is, particularly with professionals, it is really, really damaging and hurtful no matter what the professional told you. A long time ago, when I was still in, these are more articles, in I practiced law in Connecticut for a number of years before I moved to Florida. And when I was just sort of starting out, after I had been a rape crisis counselor before, while I was a nurse before I went to law school. So when I got out, I became the rape crisis center of New Haven Rape Crisis Center, sort of de facto lawyer. But I got a call from a lawyer in another part of the state who was advising a psychiatrist who was writing a book about sexual boundary violations. And I told her that, at least in Connecticut, I don't know if it's true, it's not true in Florida, and I don't know if it's true in Colorado, but Connecticut passed a law that actually just added to the so-called statutory rape statute, that a therapist, a teacher, a priest, doctor, if they had sexual relations with their patients, that it was a felony. And it is a felony. I will tell you, Florida doesn't have that. And again, I don't know what states have it. But this lawyer called me about that. And I was talking to her about the bill and how in the original bill, lawyers had been included, right? Doctors, and when does that happen? It doesn't generally happen if you are a trusted estates lawyer, I guess, but it does happen in the family law setting where you have somebody, who's going through a difficult divorce, and that is when they're most vulnerable. So the woman was a little bit offended by this. I don't know why. So she said to me, I need to tell you this story. So she heard a story about another lawyer who had been representing a woman in a very large, money divorce. There were millions of dollars at stake. And he was sleeping with his client during the pendency of the litigation. And, at the end of the case, as all resolves, he hands her a bill for $150,000. And she says to him, sorry, I've already paid. And he never got his $150,000. So she was offended by this. And I said, I appreciate that, but in this situation, that professional only needed to keep his pants on to avoid such a terrible thing. He shouldn't be prosecuted. I don't care that, it's not, that isn't the point. So, this is still sort of the evolving world of Me Too, and hopefully this has been of some value to all of you. If you have questions, I would be happy to take them because it's 20 after the hour, so I think we're almost out of time. I'll show you the rest of my slides.
Right,
There's resources.
Oh, sorry, we'll give everyone a second to type in any questions that they may have.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead with the resources and all.
Okay. Doesn't seem to be any questions. My contact information is on the PowerPoint. If anybody has questions later on and wants to reach out, feel free to do that. You can call me, you can send me an email. I can send more information to those who are interested in learning more about this. And I'm available to anyone, lawyers, advocates, whoever else is out there to do this. This to me is, a mission. So thank you so much. I'm going to show you my last one. There you go. Thank you so much. And again, I can certainly stick around. We can stick around for a minute or two if there's any more questions.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll do that. Thank you so much, Susan. I've put the evaluation in the chat. Please do that. It, of course, helps Susan. I've also got a question about what other types of trainings you might like to see COVA put on. So please help us out with the eval. And yeah, I mean, personally or professionally, we're probably all going to run across someone who may need, some professional drug treatment and assistance. So I want to thank you for helping us navigate kind of the snakes from or the wolf from the sheep, as the case may be. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, but then if anybody wants to stay on and have a question, we'll do that.
Okay, great. Thank you.